Hey everybody, this is the fourth here, and in this video I just wanted to give you some tips to help you get the most out of utilizing reverb and delay in your mixing process. So the first tip I have here is to reverb most, if not all of your sounds, at least slightly. Now this isn't a rule, but it definitely helps your mix sound more natural and give a better sense of space in your mix to have at least a little bit of reverb on each sound. And a lot of the times you'll be using pretty short-tailed reverb for things like drums and other stuff. So you don't really use it so much as an effect like you might initially think of, especially as a beginner. But you're rather using it to help glue your different sounds together and make things sound a little bit more natural. Give them a space to exist in so that we perceive the space, and everything just sounds a little bit better that way. So for certain atmospheric sounds you might have really long reverbs, for certain lead sounds you might have really long reverbs, but for your drums you might have pretty short reverbs that just kind of glue those drums together and put them in a space. Now, like I said, this isn't a rule and there are always exceptions. If you really don't like the sound of reverb on a certain sound, there's no reason you have to use it, but just make sure that you're at least trying to put a short tail reverb on it, because you can be surprised at how subtle that short tail reverb is. It doesn't really affect the sound in a very perceivable way, but at the same time it makes it fit with the rest of the track and really blends everything together, even though someone without a trained ear might not even pick up on that reverb. Now, my next tip here is don't overdo it. So in the previous tip I mentioned it's usually a good idea to have reverb on most, if not all of your sounds in a mix. And this is a great tip, it's a great thing to do, it's a great practice to get in the habit of. But you usually don't want to have a ton of reverb on every sound. If you have too much reverb on all of your sounds, it can make your song sound too distant or muddy or just washed out, and it just ends up not sounding that great. So a little bit of reverb can really go a long way in producing the desired effect. A natural sounding sense of space, gluing your sounds together and producing just a little bit of atmosphere. So larger amounts of reverb should be reserved for achieving a certain effect or specific sounds that really need that big, present, long reverb to create the kind of sound you want in your track. So subtle reverb is often all that's required for most sounds in a mix, but especially depending on the genre, there can be sounds or sets of sounds that you would use a lot more reverb on. So it's really up to you to decide how much is enough, and this will vary from track to track and person to person. It's very much a personal preference. My advice to you would be, again, pay attention to a reference track if you're kind of unsure how much reverb is too much. And my next tip here is to avoid having too many low frequencies present in your reverb. In most cases, you don't need reverb on the lower frequencies of a sound for the reverb sound to be nice and full. In fact, reverb on the lower frequencies can often cause muddiness in your mix. This is why it's helpful to set the low cut on your reverb in such a way that it kind of filters out those low frequencies that will end up causing muddiness or just distract from the mix. And alternatively, you can use a separate EQ to high pass that reverb or low shelf it. But many reverb plugins will have a parameter that will kind of filter out the low frequency some, or just reduce them, or they may even have a built-in EQ that you could do it with. So how you do it will depend on the way you like to do it. It will depend on the plugins you're using. And you just want to set the cutoff at a point where the reverb doesn't sound too thin or too muddy. If you're using an EQ to filter out those frequencies, you probably don't want a super steep curve just so that it keeps sounding natural and doesn't sound a little bit weird or anything. And there are always going to be instances and sounds where you don't want to filter out any of the lows, or you might even want to enhance the lows, like a reverb kick, for example. But for the majority of your sounds, you probably want to reduce the amount of bass that is produced by the reverb, just because you don't want your track to get muddy from that reverb or washed out or anything like that. My next tip here is to adjust the stereo width of the reverb. Reverb plays an important part in the creation of your stereo image and your atmosphere, so it's important to use a reverb with an appropriate stereo width to get the sound that you want. You don't want it to be too wide, but you also don't want it to be too thin. In the Fruity Reverb 2 plugin, if you remember that video, it has a built-in stereo width knob that only affects the reverb. So that's a great way to do it. Other ways to increase or decrease your stereo width on a reverb would be to use it on a send and use the stereo width knob on the mixer, or use some other stereo widening or reducing effect. Maybe mid-side EQ, for example. You just want to adjust that reverb, adjust the stereo image of that reverb to really help set your atmosphere and get your track sounding exactly how you want to in terms of the stereo image with that reverb. And the last tip I have for you here isn't strictly a tip. It's just kind of looking at delay and reverb. Whether you should use just one or whether you should use both, or which one should you use. And I personally think that if you're only going to use one of them, you should probably use a reverb. So I usually end up using a delay and a reverb if I want to use a delay on a sound, but I won't really ever use just delay. But a lot of times what you can hear in professionally mixed tracks that you might think is reverb is actually well-used delay. So delay definitely plays a huge role in getting that really big sound that you kind of think of when you think about reverb. So I definitely encourage you to play around with delay, because it is a huge help in getting those nice long tails on different sounds. Where a reverb kind of can fall short, a delay can really help with that. And one little thing that I do when I use delay and reverb sometimes is, if I'm using a longer delay time and a lot of feedback, so it kind of keeps playing, it plays for a while, that delay, I will usually send that delay through the same reverb that I sent the original sound through. And this just helps that delay not sound dry when it's kind of sustaining in your track. Just having that reverb on the delay is a really nice sound. And along these same lines, I personally don't route reverb through a delay. It's just not a sound that I like. I don't know how many people are on the same page as me, but I really don't like the sound of routing a reverbed sound through the delay. So usually what I'll do is I'll route the original sound through the reverb and also through the delay independently of the reverb. And then maybe I'll send that delay back through the reverb. But what you do is up to you. You play around with it, see what kind of sound you like, and definitely don't ignore delay, because delay is really powerful, and I definitely see the potential for beginners to kind of overlook delay in favor of reverb, but delay is definitely important for getting those really huge sounds.